Hey everyone, Pastor Jimmy at Mount Pleasant Baptist Church. We're going to have a new study on a new person in the Bible. We're going to continue looking at different people in the Bible in this video. And this video series is going to look at Asa, one of the kings of Israel. He's not a very known character in the Bible. He's not one that people would just know by name a lot of times. If you mention his name, they may say, "Who is he?" He is a king in Israel after a time when Israel is split into two nations, and many of the kings, as we'll see, had not been following God. And so as we look at Asa today, his story can be found in 1 Kings chapter 15 and 16, also a little bit in chapter 22. We see a little bit about him in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 10. We see a lot about him in 2 Chronicles chapters 14 through 16. And then we can see some more about him in 2 Chronicles 20, verse 32, and then 21, verse 12. So that's a lot of verses he's mentioned in the Old Testament. So we wanted to begin looking at him. In this video today, we're going to look at his significance in Scripture. So why is he there? Why is he so important? Why should we study him? One thing to remember as we go through this series of looking at different people in the Bible is to understand that every person that is mentioned in the Bible is mentioned there for a reason. God placed them in the Bible. He placed them in Scripture for us to learn from. There are different things we can learn. Sometimes we learn about the good things that they've done. Sometimes we learn about the bad things that they've done. Sometimes it's just an ideal for us to see how we can turn back to God or how we can not turn away from God sometimes when circumstances happen. So as we look at Asa today, we want to look at why he is in Scripture. What's his importance? Other than the fact that he was a king in Israel, what else is in Scripture about him? Why did God put his story and these specific stories in there? Well, first thing that I want us to look at is we read this story, we will see as we go through this story, we will see that he removed the idols from Israel. So during this time in the nation of Israel, it was a time when they had turned away from God. Many of the kings had not turned people back toward God. Many of them had allowed them to set up idols and worship other gods from other people in the land that surrounded them, other nations that were around them, and they began worshiping the same gods, worshiping the same idols. And as we'll see, King Asa is one that came in and he began to get rid of the idols in the nation of Israel and pointed people back toward God. Also, as we look through his story, we will see that he is the first king since Solomon. And we can look at the kings, or you can read the different list of kings. He's the first king since Solomon to follow God and to move his people toward God. And so here he is living in a world, living in a nation that was God's chosen people, but God's chosen people had determined that they were going to turn their back on God. And because of that, many of the kings had just given in to the people, and they decided that they would allow the people to do what they wanted to do. And now here, as we study Asa, we're going to see him come in and we're going to see him turn back to God and follow God, even though the people of the nation maybe did not want to at the time. So it's important for us to study his story to see that we live in a nation that is similar to this today. We live in a nation where people don't want to turn to God. There are many, many idols out there that people worship instead of God. We may look around and say, well, we don't have statues, we don't do sacrifices. But if we look at what people worship other people. There's so many idols, as we call them, in our country today that people worship instead of looking to God. They take their words as truth instead of looking at God's truth for words. We look at our country today where people worship money and power and success over anything else. They say if you don't have money, power, or success, then you're a nothing in the world today. And so our world today has turned their back on God, and Asa shows us that we need to have the courage to stand up, trust in God, and turn toward Him. He turned toward God. Yes, he was a king, but like anyone in power, the people were still driving a lot of the decisions that were being made. And we see him have the ability and the courage to stand up and serve God in a time when no one else would. And then Asa prepared Israel for revival. He reigned for 41 years, and he prepared for a religious revival that would take place after he passed away and his son would take over. He prepared them for this revival that God was bringing. And so my question for a lot of us as we look at Asa's significance in Scripture is, what are we doing to prepare the next generation for God? What are we doing to prepare the next generation for a revival to come upon our land? Are we doing our job to prepare others and teach them about God so that a revival can come about? And Asa did this. He prepared the people so that when the second generation came about, when the other generation of kings came about, they were ready for this revival to come in the land because he had stood up for God when no one else would. So as we study Asa's life, we're going to see a lot of important things that he has done. We're going to look at the challenges that he had as he did this. As you can imagine, there were many. We're going to look at his failures. Yes, he was a man. He had sin and he failed. Some of his failures that we look at will help us in our lives today. And then we'll continue to look at how we can learn from studying him in Scripture. So continue to read 1 Kings 15 and 16. 2 Chronicles 14 through 16. Understand who Asa is. See some of the things in his life. In the next video, we'll begin to look at the challenges he had in his life and what we can learn from those challenges in our own life.